Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you to the Pilgrim Church for this invitation, and I'm very pleased to be here. What I want to do is to share with you some thoughts on approaching the question of understanding Islam. And I want to begin, in a sense, with 12 years ago and September 11th, 2001. It seems to me that those events created a new public discussion internationally on Islam and the role of Islam in society. For those who had thought that the end of communism meant a new conflict, Huntington's idea of a clash of civilizations, to some extent, September the 11th appeared to represent the culmination of that idea, that there was a fundamental clash between Islam and between the rest of the world. And at the same time, of course, the response to that was predominantly by the United States administration, aided particularly by the British administration, which was the war on terror, which for many in the Muslim world was represented by some forces as being a war on Islam. Of course, within the West, the idea that Islam is a religion of violence, the religion of the sword, is quite well established. And it wasn't people in the popular press or in the streets, but it was the academic writers of the Enlightenment which had that view. For instance, Montesquieu contrasts the moderate Christian prince with the fanatical Islamic one. And so quite deep within Western culture and academia and thought is this idea that Islam is fanatical, violent, and therefore problematic. September the 11th appeared to bring that idea to a very dramatic conclusion. But of course, what we need to look at is what really Islam is about, and that the Orientalist ideas of what Islam is about has to be seen against the background of real Islamic history. Was Islam a religion of the sword? Was it a religion with forced conversions? It's often forgotten that the first Islamic empire, the Umayyad Empire, which was established in Damascus 30 years or so after the death of the Prophet in the 7th century, had about 8% of its population as Muslims. And the Umayyads, for instance, were against converting anybody on the grounds, quite practically, that if you didn't convert people, you could impose the poll tax, and therefore you could get quite a considerable amount of money. So first of all, we have to see that the expansion of Islam, the rapid expansion of Islam after the death of the Prophet, was not something done with forced conversions. But also we have to look at, of course, the founding ideas of Islam which are contained in the Quran. The Quran, the recitation for Muslims, the word of God revealed to the Prophet Muhammad over a period of 22 years by the Archangel Gabriel, contains a very important record of a revelation which places itself in the context of monotheism. The Prophet did not come to upturn previous revelations in the Abrahamic traditions. In the Quran we read of Abraham, of Moses, and indeed of Jesus and Mary. And as a consequence, the Quranic text provides us with a very interesting commentary on, if you like, the whole development of monotheism. Whether we agree with the balance sheet which is contained in it, that the previous faiths had betrayed in various ways the revelations, that is a different question. But as Georges Wassouf, the Lebanese popular singer during the terrible Lebanese civil war, sang, it was important to understand that for Christians you can see the face of Jesus, and for Muslims you can see the face of Moses, of Musa. And as a consequence, as he pointed out, in the context of that extremely bloody war, which appeared to be based on confessional differences, the real question was, why are we fighting and why are we killing, when within the Quran there is this possibility of reconciliation and unity. However, we do also have to accept that in the 20th and 21st centuries, the rise of political Islam in the Muslim world, and now of course spreading in small groups and others to the rest of the world, we face a rather different situation in understanding the relationship between religion and politics. And it's that particular problem that often obscures our understanding of what Islam is about. Political regimes based upon Islam have, we know, sprung up. The Islamic Republic of Iran, the Islamic system which exists in Saudi Arabia, the big discussions after the Arab Spring about what kind of governance should replace those which had existed across North Africa and the Middle East. And in that, one of the main voices arguing for a different type of society has been the forces of political Islam. And what we have seen as a consequence of the rise of turning Islam into politics has been actually a sacrificing of Islam itself. That is my particular thesis. It's very interesting if you read the works of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or the works of other even narrower Islamist organizations. What is interesting is that the rich history of Islamic civilization, philosophy and jurisprudence and theology is largely ignored. For the Muslim Brotherhood and for like-minded organizations, what happened in the great period of the strength of Islam during the Middle Ages, when the Islamic philosophers and scientists were developing, for instance, optics, making advances in mathematics, creating new forms of technology, very much, if you like, what California is today and parts of China are today. Those kind of advances required a huge degree of openness. Openness to other ideas, openness to other religions, openness to philosophies which came particularly from the Greeks. And it's very important to realize that the great strength of Islam in its most powerful phase, when it was extremely dynamic, for instance, at the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, it was Islam, an Islamic government regime, which welcomed, for instance, Jews fleeing from persecution in Spain. It was the Islamic libraries which were the first public libraries in the world. When Oxford University opened, it had 8,000 books. In the same year, the public library of Baghdad had 100,000. The idea of learning, of pluralism, of engaging in debates was quite central to the idea of within the Islamic world. It was a confident world in which no ideas were threats, they were challenges. And so what we have to realize is that the often images that we have of Islam today from certain parts of the Islamic world, in which apparently very narrow ideas are being offered. The idea, for instance, that is being debated in the Afghan parliament to try to amend the criminal code to allow the stoning of those who've been involved in unlawful sex, the crime of zina. This is what often hits the headlines and what often many in the Islamist sphere of politics believe are what Islam is about. But if you return to the classical discussions in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, you won't find the idea that punishments are the key aspect, for instance, of Islamic law. Indeed, the early theorists and jurists mostly thought that such punishments could not be applied until you would achieve something quite different. Not an ordinary society, but you had to have a perfect society, a just society. That meant social equality and economic equality. That would be a requirement before you could even think of implying the punishments taken from the hudud, which is often looked at in the West as a form of criminal law. The Prophet himself, of course, said that it's recorded as saying, avoid punishment at all costs, even develop an excuse to avoid giving a punishment. A very different approach to the kind of way in which both the Islamist political organizations and within the West, amongst the press and amongst sections of academia, approached the question of Islam. Seeing Islam as something which was set in stone in the 7th century, which created a legal and political order which is unchangeable, and therefore one which is necessarily rooted in a far-off and distant time. It's interesting that there is this coincidence between both Western conceptions and some political conceptions within the Muslim world. But this is not an accident. Because if you look at the kind of organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, which ruled Egypt for 1 year up until July this year, and others which are in power, for instance, in a slightly different way in Tunisia at the present time, and which are vying for power in very many parts of the Middle East, these organizations were founded in the 20th century. They were founded as modern political organizations, far from being fundamentalist in the sense of going back to a true past. They are, in fact, truly modernist. They do not have their roots within the Islamic history and civilization that I have been referring to. In fact, if you read the accounts of the ideologues of these movements, you will find that they rule out a progressive and optimistic view of the development of Islam. Islam has actually been a failure. A failure, why? Because most of the Islamic world, according to such organizations, are ruled by fake Muslims, those who are corrupted. Most practices which are taking place are in fact not genuinely Islamic. People are no longer living an Islamic way of life, corrupted by modernity, the West, and so on and so forth. This would mean that after 1400 years, Islam has been reduced to the small groups, or relatively small groups, who comprise these organizations. Now, this has had a profound effect within the Muslim world, both at the level of governments and at the level of public discussion in the street. And that is something that we need to bear in mind when we are thinking about the question of interfaith relations, discussions and debates. That the space for political discussions and religious discussions within many Islamic countries is very closed at the present time as a consequence of politics and fear. Those who want to write about Islam in a way which goes back, in my view, to this classical times, many of them are forced to live and write in the West, in the United States and in Europe and in Australia. This is a terrible tragedy. Why do so many writers, theorists, jurists, and theologians have to flee their countries of origin in order to write freely about Islam? And the answer is to do with this terrible mixture between religion and politics. The transformation of religion into politics is basically the problem that we face in trying to deal and trying to understand what is taking place in the Muslim world. Those who have had to go into intellectual exile in order to speak their mind, and ironically often writing not in Arabic or in Persian, but writing in English, is and has undermined the education, Islamic education, within the Muslim world itself. And so what I want to say today is that in order to open up a discussion, we have to understand that the West has a series of important responsibilities. The first responsibility is to encourage Islamic education. It has been quite problematic, the way in which Islamic education has been pursued within the West. In Britain, for example, it has been designated since 2001 rather, as a strategic study. It is, in fact, only related, why is it strategic? It's related to terrorism. Terrorism is not something which is connected, in my view, to Islam and to Muslims at all. If you read, for instance, the 800-page fatwa by Al-Qadri, a Pakistani theorist, not only does he say that terrorism is contrary to Islam, he says quite rightly that terrorism places anyone outside of Islam. It's not merely being a bad Muslim, you are a non-Muslim to participate in terrorism. And the reason is quite simple, because if you look at the classical Islamic law on the question of international relations, the Siyar, which comes from the 9th century, you will see that at that stage, the Islamic contribution to international law was to highlight the importance of humanitarian principles in warfare, something which in the West we only began to articulate with the First Geneva Convention of 1864. Within the Islamic text of the time, the idea of targeting civilians was totally unacceptable and regarded as unlawful. Carrying out environmental warfare, poisoning rivers, destroying crops, destroying animals for food, all those things were banned. The treatment of prisoners of war in a correct and humane manner was essential. This is the real law of jihad, by the way, not what is portrayed often by some small alleged Muslim organizations, and often marketed within the West as jihadi terrorism. There is no such thing as jihadi terrorism. Jihad, using military means within Islamic law, is very much like the regulation of the use of force and international humanitarian law within general international law. So if we return to some of the central tenets of Islamic education, both within the West and within the Islamic world, we can begin to perhaps recover some of the great treasury of the pluralist and more confident idea of what Islam was in the early period up until the Middle Ages. So if the West can do one thing, it is to focus upon developing good Islamic education. But there is, of course, something else that we need to do. We do also need better relations with the Muslim world. And that is something which is very interesting, that we meet today at the background of this quite important advance in relationships with Iran over the nuclear question. And it's often posed as if this is a conflict between the West, or the 5 permanent members of Security Council plus Germany, and Iran. And often what is forgotten in all this discussion is that Imam Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, issued a very long and detailed fatwa which says that nuclear weapons are unlawful according to Islamic law. Now it seems to me that in building new relations or good relations with the Islamic world, one of the things we need to do is to mobilize Islam for that purpose. We need to mobilize the fact that within Islamic thinking, there are many attributes which we can relate to and work with. So if we begin to think of Islam not as portrayed by the Al-Qaeda and those 19 hijackers of those planes on the 11th of September 2001, but begin to think of a Islam which was rich in theory, in science, and in humanity, an Islam which was the center for refugees, an Islam which allowed, for instance, during the best years in Spain, of religious dialogues in Toledo. If we begin to focus upon this history and begin to think of these traditions, it seems to me that that's the best background in which we can begin to develop genuine relationships between those of different faiths and those of different cultures and political outlook. So my general remarks which I'm making today are for us all, in a sense, to become students of Islam and to read things for ourselves, to engage in a very important project of trying to understand how the Islamic world works. And that, I think, is something which we, on the whole, have not done as Western societies. Western societies have been far too wedded to the ideas of Montesquieu, to the idea of this binary distinction between the moderate, peaceful Christian and the fanatical, violent Muslim. September the 11th was a wake-up call for the international community, that we cannot allow the small minority of violent people to dictate how we understand our world. The terrible mistake of George Bush and Tony Blair was to allow Al-Qaeda to set an international agenda. Our opportunity and our challenge is to try to set an agenda which is positive, universalist, and has the possibility of genuine exchange. There are many difficulties, and let's be very clear, there are many difficulties. There are tremendous dissensions inside the Islamic world. Over the weekend, I think 100 people, civilians, were killed in Iraq as a consequence of Sunni-Shia conflict. In Pakistan, we know there is a terrible situation, particularly in the north of the country, with the Pakistani Taliban. We know that Western troops are about to leave Afghanistan, and there is probably going to be an even bigger renewed conflict between whatever government succeeds Karzai and the Taliban in Afghanistan. We have to accept these are real obstacles, but we also need to think that unless we actually get to grips with setting a new agenda, we will then become hostage to those organizations and to their agenda. And I think we want ours. Thank you for your attention.